Welcome to Two Taps and Friends. Grab your favorite drink, get comfy, and let's dive into another episode of Two Taps.
Welcome to Two Taps and Friends, everybody. I'm your host, Daniel Rosenberg, and I have my special colleague, Lloyd Golburgh, back on. I have Lloyd back on. Welcome back, first of all.
Thank you.
I'm going to be bringing Lloyd on pretty consistently because we're going to try to tackle this Israel-Palestine issue for you guys and educate as much as we can because there's so much misinformation out there. We want to make sure that, people are hearing this information because this isn't really the information that's being pumped out. But welcome back, Lloyd.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good. So I figured we'd kind of, go into some specifics because we did kind of this wide-sweeping general thing last time, and there's just so much information there.
Yes.
And I don't want to keep the viewers on for 4 hours at a time because nobody's going to listen for 4 hours at a time.
Exactly.
You're right? So, I mean, I thought that we went over this, me and you, obviously, off camera, trying to figure out how we break this thing down or some of the things we go into. So I think we should start with some of the different historical expulsions. Because last episode we talked about, this theory that the Jews are colonizers. This was Arab land. The Jews have no right to this. And it's been, they've only been there, haven't been there in forever and ever. I think that we go through some of the different expulsions of Jews and the times. And I kind of turn it over to you if you want to go through that a little bit.
Sure. And we talked about this last time, and we won't spend a lot of time on the ancient history, but it's important to start there only in the sense that obviously, I guess it's not obvious, but from a factual perspective, a historical perspective, an archaeological perspective, Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel.
Right.
At the time, of course, 2,000 years ago, everything was tribal. There were no boundaries. There were no nation states, of course.
Right.
But the land was inhabited by all kinds of different tribes. And the land of Eretz Israel, which is what you and I both know today, to encompass Israel itself, Israel proper is what we call it,
right.
The Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria, which is now called the West Bank.
Right.
These was a territory, and at the time it had different names. So it had the name of Canaan at the beginning, and then later during the Roman Empire it was changed to Philistine, and it was done that way on purpose because when the Romans invaded and conquered the territory, they decided that in order to erase the Jewish indigeneity to the land, they changed the name from Judea, which is the southern region, which was the southern kingdom, because Israel was initially a kingdom,
right,
under King Saul, and then the kingdoms were split into two, and you had the kingdom of Israel in the north, and then you had Judea in the south, and you had Christians living there, you had Jews living there, you had Arabs that had come up from the Arabian Peninsula, and were living in that land. It was a territory. It was never a nation state.
right.
As a matter of fact, it didn't become a nation state until 1948, when the League of Nations and then the United Nations, its postcursor, if you will, established the nation of Israel in the territory. So the idea that Jews came later and began to colonize the land is just factually inaccurate. Jews
Right.
have always had and have continuously maintained a presence in the territory. So what happened initially was, of course, you had conquests. You had the Babylonian conquest.
Right.
And then Jews were expelled during that period of time and sent to what we now call the diaspora, which is...
What was that approximate time?
Oh, Lord, we're talking about 1,000 before the Common Era, about 1,000 BCE.
Right, right.
And then after the Babylonian rule, then there was the Muslim conquests. And then the Muslims came in, and they actually, the Persians, to be more specific, and they allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and join their fellow Jews who never left in the first place.
Right.
So they came back, and they were able to reestablish their temple and ultimately regain sovereignty over the land of Israel. And then, of course, they were expelled again. So first the Babylonians, and then the Romans expelled the Jews from the land. And then the Ottoman Empire ultimately, if you fast forward, took over. Okay, and the Ottomans controlled the territory for some 400 or 500 years.
Right.
But Jews still remained in Eretz Israel, which was the land of Israel. We call it Eretz Israel. It's the land of Israel. Jews still remained there. And although lived as second-class citizens, what we call dhimmis, they were treated pretty well under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, they were more of a secular type of regime, if you will, and they promoted individual religious freedom amongst Christians, Jews, Muslims, Arabs, and so that was a relatively decent time for Jews, but still never left the land en masse. So every time Jews had sovereignty over the land of Israel, they were ultimately expelled by a greater power and then came back over time.
Right.
So not only did they not fully leave, not only were they not fully expelled, but they always maintained their desire to return.
After being colonized essentially over and over again. I think it's interesting that these terms, talk about cultural misappropriation, right? These terms that are being used to attack the Jews are terms that the Jews have gone through forever. You're talking about colonizing, which they've obviously been colonized over and over again. You're talking about genocide. We all know what genocide the Jews went through.
Right.
You're talking about apartheid. You want to talk about apartheid?
Right.
The only apartheid in Israel right now, if you go, is if you try to go into the Muslim quarters and the Jews aren't allowed. They're Judenrein, as they say in German, no Jews, right?
That's right.
It's incredible, the irony and the sinister methods that are being used to attack the Jews as well.
It's on purpose.
Sure.
Everything is an inversion of history. Like you said, they accuse the Jews of committing genocide. Well, what is the definition of genocide? First of all, the definition arose out of the Holocaust, right? And the definition of genocide was the intentional elimination of a people solely for the purpose of eliminating that people.
Right.
So you would have to suspend disbelief, and you would have to find that in current times, using that term, that Israel and Jews simply want to eliminate the Palestinians because they're Palestinians. It ignores the fact that first of all, that is anathema to the core of what Jewish people stand for. And as a matter of fact, in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which is a document that to me nobody ever looks to,
Right.
the principles of the state of Israel are stated within the document. And in the document itself, it discusses respecting the people and the religion and diversity and freedom of speech and of all people that are inhabitants of the territory of Palestine. So, the inversion is on purpose, okay? There's no genocide that's happening. Israel is simply attempting to make sure that the radical Islamists that currently, at least in that region, go by the name of Hamas, aren't able to invade, attack, slaughter, and kidnap them again. And
Right.
that is the goal. That is not genocide. As a matter of fact, the Arab population continues to grow. And nowhere else in the world, anywhere in history, has there ever been a genocide where the population that is supposedly the victim of genocide has multiplied.
Right, it's triple. It's something like triple. It would
Yeah.
start off, what is it, went from like 75,000, 100,000 to 2 million?
There's over 2.1 million Muslims living in Israel. I think I wanted to just touch on that point about the apartheid, because, we hear, in the West and in the United States, we hear a lot about checkpoints and apartheid walls and how the communities are split and that there are different laws for Jews and different laws for Arabs. And it's a complete factual inaccuracy.
Complete, especially if you've been there and you know.
Well, and this is the problem, is that people don't understand the geography, okay? So, for example, yes, there are walls that separate Greater Israel from Gaza. There are boundaries that separate Greater Israel from what is now called the West Bank.
Right.
Because those are territories that don't belong to Israel.
They're not governed by Israel.
They're not governed by Israel.
Governed by the
so
Palestinian Authority. One's governed by Hamas.
That's exactly right. And they are theoretically sovereign territories.
Right.
Okay, now, of course, the Israelis, and I'm not afraid to use the word occupation.
Sure.
The Israelis certainly are occupying Judea and Samaria, or what you would call the West Bank today, but there's a reason for that.
For safety. I mean, it's
Only.
literally mingled. It's impossible to defend that if you're in that area. Literally, I can look across the street at some places, and you're looking at the West Bank or Judea and Samaria as opposed to proper Israel. So it's just impossible to do. If there was some kind of a showing over time that there could be trust and there could be, a coexistence there, then the occupying wouldn't have to happen.
And Israel's tried to do that.
Of course, over and over again.
This is another thing. I have this argument with people all the time, and it's why are the Arabs killing the Jews? And the response I always get is, well, the Jews shouldn't be on their land. And that's a whole nother topic that we can discuss, because I still don't understand why only Jews, immigration for Jews, they were the only ones for whom immigration, for whom death and expulsion is the response to immigration.
Right.
Everybody else, we can have open borders and we can welcome in, as many people as we want. Everybody should get the opportunity, except Jews. So if Jews were to emigrate, to say Palestine, okay, and buy swampland and build there, the penalty is death or expulsion. And to me, it's, again, that's a
They're
whole.
just using superficial terms, immigration and land. It's all, we talked about it. It's a deeper
Yes.
history. It's a religious history.
Yes.
It's a combination of all of it.
Yes.
Some of them don't even know why, the new generation, who knows what they've been taught in the territories there in Gaza? Who knows we kind of know what they're being taught. We see, I saw Douglas Murray, I'm reading his new book. He talks about, he went through Gaza and Mein Kampf, how many copies
Everywhere.
of Mein Kampf
It's in every home in Gaza.
Elder, the Protocols of Zion. These are all the most anti-Semitic writings in the history of man.
Yes.
He talks about when he was in Egypt visiting a friend. He literally walked around in bookshops, and that's what they have.
Yes.
That's what they're teaching their people. So
That's right.
it's so much deeper than immigration issues, right?
Well, and back to the apartheid walls. It's very important to understand that, again, Gaza is a sovereign territory.
Sure.
The Israelis left there in 2005. They pulled out all of their people, including the dead. I mean, they didn't even leave graves behind. So the Jews tried to, we call it land for peace. They tried to, give up land for peace. And the Arabs, of course, they sign the peace treaties and they say, okay, and then they get the land, and then what do? They build an infrastructure so that they can then later retaliate and kill the Jews and reclaim the land. In the West Bank, it's the same thing. Of course, like in any other country, if I'm going to go to Europe, right? If I'm going to go to England, I got to go through a checkpoint. I have to go through customs. I have to show a passport.
Sure.
This is exactly the same thing that we're talking about that happens in Israel.
That's a confusion. Just like saying the Canadians don't have the same rights as the Americans. Like, okay,
Right.
you're right.
Right. How dare the Americans
you're right.
require the Canadians to show papers when they come through the border?
But that's how ridiculous it is, because there's 2 million, and you hear this. I don't know if it sinks for these people or they don't want to hear it. There's 2 million Arab, Muslim Israelis.
Yes.
They fight in the military. They're judges. One of them was a judge that put a prime minister in jail.
Yes.
They literally are I think 60% of the doctors' workforce are Muslims in Israel. These people are citizens of Israel.
Yes.
They have the exact same rights as Israelis.
That's exactly right.
Does someone in Gaza? No.
No.
They're not governed by the Israelis.
No. And that is the point, isn't
Right.
it? In other words, within the state
But
of
that's
Israel.
not apartheid. That's not apartheid.
Of course not.
Okay.
Because apartheid
Right.
is separate laws for separate people.
For the same citizens.
That's exactly right. Now, and I'm glad you made that point, because it really is analogous to here in the United States.
Right.
In the Declaration, Israel does not have a constitution. We know this,
Right.
but they do have a Declaration of Independence,
Right.
and these ideas are encompassed within the Declaration of Independence. Every single citizen of Israel, whether you're Druze, whether you're a Jew, whether you're an Arab, a Muslim,
Christian.
a Christian,
Right.
Buddhist,
Same right.
gay, trans, you name it, you have the same rights as everybody.
100% across the board blindly.
That's
and
right.
that's are there biases and prejudices just like any other society? Probably, but not by law, and it doesn't work that way.
That's
Like,
correct. You have Arabs in government. You have opposition parties that are full of Arabs
Right.
within the government in Israel. You have Arab police officers. You have Arab doctors and Jewish doctors that work together in hospitals and as emergency medical professionals in every aspect of life in Israel. It is a very diverse country where everybody shares the same equal rights.
It's just so complex because there's so many layers to what's going on. Because even the Arab Muslim citizens, they will tell you they're Israelis, right?
That's right.
They will tell you they have the same rights, but in their religious teachings, they might not be. They might be hostile to Jews, and they might be hostile. I'm generalizing.
No,
There's a complexity there. There's so much there, and then
Yes.
there's so much history to be read, and to really understand it. So, when people,
I think you have this dichotomy between allegiance to a state and then allegiance to your religion or your faith. And in Islam, the allegiance is to the faith,
right?
nothing else. To them, there's no such thing as physical boundaries.
Nations.
It's a caliphate, and that is what they seek. Now, of course, we generalize because we don't have a lot of time, and and I think we did cover this last time, that you might have different categories of Muslims.
Sure, just like
So you
Jews
have-
and Christians.
Of course, you
Right.
have your extremists, and you have people that are more reform.
Right.
But yes, there are, of those 2 million Muslim Arab citizens of Israel, I would argue that the vast majority of them are patriotic Israelis, and will tell you, this is my country. And like you said, they fight in the military for Israel.
Right. I mean, and that's something that, if you understand that, it's hard, especially when you're listening to these arguments, and you're listening to people, and we'll get to that a little bit later. We're going to talk about some of these experts that are talking that don't know what they're talking about. But I think to talk about some of the cultural issues there as well. Like, let's talk about the Nakba, all right? We hear this Nakba, right?
Yep.
And a Nakba, what does it mean? It's like catastrophe. What does it mean in Arabic? I forgot the word. It translates to like the catastrophe.
It's a
here.
catastrophe.
right?
It's
And it's referring to the time where the Israelis, after they were attacked by literally 5 Arab nations attacked, the day they called it, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, all attacked
Yes.
this little nation
Yes.
and lost
Yes.
over and over again, but this is the first time.
Yep.
In that loss, a lot of the Muslim community, or the Arabs that were there, were told by their leaders to leave.
Yes.
We're going to take the Jews out,
Yes.
and we'll have you back in no time,
Yes.
right? And I'm sure there's others that weren't. It wasn't all exact. There's some expulsions, I'm sure,
Yes.
after war. We talked about that.
Yes.
But in that culture, to talk about loss in that, like, we lost the war, doesn't really happen. And I'll just go to a quick example before you go in depth. In the book, I think it was Douglas Murray, I'm citing him a lot because he's very eloquent and very researched speaker, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bestseller. He says that he was in Egypt one time with his friend, and they were just, like having fun, going out, having dinners, and there was a day that they were honoring. There was a day where the whole kind of country stood still, and he asked him, what are we celebrating? And he said, well, this is the day we celebrate our victory over Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to him, what victory over Israel? Like, they've never had a victory over Israel, right?
Right.
Well, in 1973, we won that war. This is referred to as the Yom Kippur War.
Yep.
Now, in the Yom Kippur War, they made advancements that were further and scarier than it ever had been, but they ultimately were pushed back, lost Gaza, lost Gaza before, but they lost a lot of territory there. So it's a loss. But in the culture, they're taught that it's a win, right? So I think it ties to the Nakba. Like, what are they teaching their kids? Are they teaching their kids that we got 5 nations got creamed by Israel, or
No, not at all.
exactly? And that's why this
don't-
concept comes out.
No, they don't acknowledge that they were defeated.
Right.
The Nakba, it doesn't, to them, the Nakba is not defined as the
I know.
loss to Israel. To them, the Nakba is the tragedy that Israel, I guess they could call it a victory, right? They claimed the Judea and Samaria during the 1948 war. So I suppose that could be seen as a victory for them, because at the time, again,
Well, Jordan took them.
well, yes, but they're the same people.
Exactly. Right. That's
These are the same people.
80% of Jordan are Palestinians, just so you know, or what they call Palestinians.
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's very important to set this part straight too, and that the term Palestine, I think that, at least in the West, when we hear the word Palestine, we're taught to think Arab.
Right.
Jews took Palestine.
Right.
Well, that, again, is a purposeful bastardization of the meaning of the term. Palestine was, again, a territory inhabited by Jews and Arabs and Christians.
Right.
And other smaller sects of people. It wasn't a state that belonged to anybody in particular. It was a region, and we talked about it at the opening of this podcast, where it encompassed what we call the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. It included Gaza. It included Judea and Samaria, or what we now know as the West Bank. It included parts of Syria, the northern part of Egypt. That whole area itself was Palestine.
And under the conquest of the Ottoman Empire, all colonized
All
by the Ottoman Empire,
And-
as was North Africa. Do you think Arabs come from North Africa?
No, Arabs don't come from North Africa. Arabs,
Libya, Morocco,
Arabs,
Sudan.
Arabs spilled
Tunisia?
out of the Arabian Peninsula,
Right.
southwest of Israel,
Right.
and then they, embarked on their conquests of the
Colonization.
region.
Right.
Yes, they colonized
Right.
Palestine. Okay. Then, ultimately, when the Ottoman Empire, their reign began to end, and this is what brings us to the modern era, which is World War I, right? So what happened during World War I? And then ultimately, with World War I, you had all of the colonizing powers, France and Germany in particular, sort of got together on their own and decided, okay, this is how we are going to carve up the territory that until now had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, right? There was no Palestinian state. There was no Israel. There was territory inhabited by people belonging to the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
So when the Ottoman Empire fell, then the French and the British decided how they were going to carve it up.
Right.
Okay, and the French, and in particular, this particular plot of land, Palestine, fell under the mandate. The mandate was given to the British by the League of Nations. We are the League of Nations, which was basically the international precursor to the United Nations, said, okay, now that the war is over, now that the Ottomans are defeated, somebody has to administer this land. So the British decided that they were going to administer Palestine.
Right.
The French were going to administer the areas that we now know as Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, right? Not Jordan yet.
Jordan, right,
No,
right.
Jordan was still part of Palestine, and that whole land, including Jordan, was designated as what would be the future home, the establishment of the state of Israel for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Right.
Okay? So the whole world decided that this was what was appropriate. And when that happened, the British kind of played both sides. So the British needed the help of the Arabs to defeat the Ottomans. So they went to the Arabs and they said, hey, we're going to give you, a homeland in the territory of Palestine. Help us with the war to defeat the Ottomans.
Right.
And the Arabs said, okay, thank you very much. At the same time, within a year or two of that, I think that was in 1915,
Right.
and then in 1917, the British, through the Balfour Declaration, which
So we're
was
going to get to the Balfour Declaration.
Lord
So let's go into it.
Balfour,
Right.
who was the, I guess you would call him the ambassador,
Yeah, that's what they would do for territories back
high
then.
commissioner, ambassador, they have different names,
Regional manager.
something like that, right? Where they went to the Jews
Right.
and said the same thing. Hey, listen, we need your help in defeating the Ottomans, so we're going to give you a homeland, right, in Palestine. So the Jews are thinking, okay, we're going to get a homeland. And the Arabs are thinking, okay, we're going to get a homeland. Meanwhile, when it all happened, when it all went down, you know, the Arabs and the Jews are looking at each other like, this is mine. No, this is mine, because the British promised it to both.
What's the difference? The Jews, though, said, all right, well, we could divide. The
Well,
Arabs said, no.
actually, yes, sort of. I mean, generally speaking, that is exactly
Well, it's not sort of. The
That-
Arabs weren't
that's what-
accepting Jews in the land.
right. Well, it's even worse than that for the Jews, because ultimately the Jews said, yes, we're willing to share it.
Right.
And the Arabs said, we're not willing to share it.
Right.
And then the United Nations got involved and said, okay, listen, or the League of Nations said, look, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to partition this land. We're going to have to give some of it to you, and we're going to have to give some of it to you.
Right.
And at the very last second, in exchange for their help, the Jordanian king Hussein
From the Hashemite Empire. He's from Saudi Arabia.
they carved off the mandate for
Right.
Palestine, meaning the order that land be given to the Jews. The League of Nations cut it in half and gave it to the Arabs, and the Jews were like, "You just took half of what was promised to us."
And gave it to the Arabs, called
through
Jordan.
the British mandate, and called it Transjordan at the time,
Right.
which is now Jordan.
Right.
And the Jews said, okay,
There's their land.
fine. You know, we'll take everything, you know, west of the Jordan River. You can have everything east of the Jordan River. And same thing. You know, the Arabs said no. The Jews said yes. Finally, when the British were like, okay, we're done. We can't stay here anymore. We're leaving. We grant you your homeland in Palestine, and we're out. That was on May 14th of 1948. Well, the very next day, Israel, through David Ben-Gurion, announced the Declaration of Independence.
In Tel
We
Aviv.
are in
Because
Tel Aviv.
Jerusalem was still under
That's an
control.
excellent point.
Right.
People ask that question. I think it's in the outline. Why, if you're saying that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, then why wasn't the Declaration of Independence read in Jerusalem? Well,
Couldn't
because
get
at
to
the
it.
time,
Right.
Jerusalem was not part of the mandate. Jerusalem was going to be a separate protectorate that was going to be available to everybody, managed by the international community.
Right.
Okay.
The roads were closed and blocked off, too.
Exactly. Because of the religious sites
Sure.
that are important to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Right.
So that was the plan, and it seemed like a pretty good plan. But as soon as the Jews declared an independent state of Israel in the territory, the very next day, those 5 countries, Arab countries, invaded and attacked Israel.
Right.
That's what happened.
Right. So when you talk about, when you just make a statement like the Nakba and simplify it and just say, well, that was just a day that they just pulled people out of their homes. And look, from their perspective, I understand their perspective is they lost this, they lost that, but it's much more complex. Just sight to it.
That's I'm glad you always bring me back to what we were talking about, because I do go off on the tangents, but
Sure.
that's what the Nakba actually is. It's an embarrassment. It's an affront to their honor because they lost the war.
Right.
Now, not only that, again, you mentioned it. We hear about expulsions. Again, it's a complete fabrication.
Right.
750,000 Arabs were expelled from their homes. That's
Right.
completely untrue.
Right.
There's approximately 225,000 Arabs and approximately 1,200 Jews that had to change sides. Okay, just because you had different territories now.
Right.
But the other 500,000 Arabs that are now considered as being expelled or as being refugees, they left on their own accord. And why? Because the Arab League literally spread false rumors that the Israeli army was going to rape
Right.
Arab women. Okay, again, more projection, because that's their war, not ours.
Modus operandi.
Of course. So the Arab leaders said, listen, you guys leave because there's about to be a war. We are going to invade. In order to stay out of harm's way, evacuate. We're going to destroy the Jews in a couple days. You'll be able to come back to your homes. Everything will be fine. That didn't happen because they didn't win the war. The Jews won the war. And, they repelled and defeated the Arabs, short of Jordan ultimately being able to take Judea and Samaria, which is called the West Bank. Okay, people don't know that either. That until 1948, there was no West Bank. Right? Again, territory where people lived. Jews lived, Arabs lived. And then during the war in 1948, that territory went to the Arabs, the West Bank. They took it.
Right.
Okay, and it wasn't until 1967 when they decided to attack again.
The Jordanians took it.
The Jordanians took it. So
it was never an independent Palestinian Arab nation.
Correct.
It was Jordanian, as Gaza was Egypt. Right?
That's right.
Right.
That's right. So and until 1976 when they attacked again, and at that point the Jews won that war too, and then reclaimed that territory. Okay, and that's where they are today, and that brings us to the occupation. The reason for the occupation is not simply a land grab. The Jews didn't have that land, okay, from 1948 until 1967. So you had 20 years there where it was under Jordanian control. Most of the people living in Jordan are Palestinian.
Right.
Did not create a Palestinian state. Don't know why, because it wasn't something that was because they were Arabs, not Palestinians.
Right.
Okay, that didn't come until 1964. So during that time, while it was all controlled by the Arabs, they're living right on top of the Jews. Okay, and then so of course when they attacked in 1967 and the Jews took back the West Bank, which is Judea and Samaria, because of security reasons, and that's why they occupy it now, so that the Arabs can't invade and kill them again.
Right.
And if they were to give back the West Bank, if they were to leave, then I think we mentioned this last time that I think I said that the largest area between, say, Tel Aviv and the West Bank was 9 miles. I think that's the shortest area between the two.
Right.
So I misspoke, but 9 miles between the two, you can't. It's impossible. You can't have people that want to slaughter you 9 miles away. We saw what happened on October 7th when we were that close. So it's a difficult situation.
Right. Well, talk to me about this. I'll talk about all our culture a little bit. This phenomena that we're very aware of, the self-hating Jew phenomena, right?
Yep.
And we see it, and it makes me sick to my core. And look, there's it's because it's propped up by the other side.
Yep.
They find this Jewish person that's like, well, I'm anti-Israel, and they don't speak for me.
Right. I'm anti-Zionist.
I'm anti-Zionist. That
Right.
don't even get me going on that.
Yep.
Right. But it's not a new phenomena.
No.
Like the self-hating Jew has been there since the beginning of time. You had these Jews that would, work for the Gestapo. You had the Jews that ran the ghettos and ran the concentration camps. Even it's not new to us.
That's
right. So when you prop one of those up, it might work on the third parties, but to us Jews, we know exactly what we're dealing with. What is your thought on this phenomena? How much does this get to you?
It gets to me because, at the end of the day, the Jews are alone in the world. So,
Right.
What happens with these people that we call self-hating Jews, and I think that, we generalize.
I'm generalizing, and it's
There's a psychology behind it.
Sure.
Okay, and there's a legitimate psychology behind it. I'm not saying that the attitude is legitimate.
right.
But the emotion is a real phenomenon, and I think that it comes from trying to fit in. I think it comes from
assimilating.
If I take this position that I'm anti-Zionist because everybody else at the table is, then I'll fit in. You won't hate me. I think there's always been a percentage of our people that first of all, we're a very empathetic, we're a very loving people. You can laugh all you want. Oh, we're baby killers and, we just kill Palestinians for sport. You and I both know that's a bunch of bullshit. It's inbred in us from the Bible, in all of our documents and all of our books. We care about other people. We are the ones that are destined by God to bring light to the world, not darkness.
Right.
Okay? So I think that's part of it too, is we have an empathy. So we feel bad for the Arabs. We feel bad for, people that are struggling, right? So there's a big part of that too, what I call suicidal empathy, where you're so empathetic that you ignore, your own safety, your own well-being. And I think that we have a lot of that. But, to be more, specific and direct, it's like you said, it's like the capos in the concentration camps. I really feel like it's the idea that if I act the way you want me to act, then you won't kill me. I won't end up on the trains. So my attitude to those Jews is always the same. Wake up. Nobody else cares about us. If we don't care about ourselves, we're doomed.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, those who aren't us, they can pretend to like us, but they just use us. Right. We're their useful idiots.
And the hate we're dealing with.
And they're on the train.
Right.
I always tell them, you guys are on the trains, man. When those trains come for us, you might be last because they need you to push us on to the trains. But when we're all done and we're all on the trains, guess what? They're going to look at you and they're going to say, you're on the train too. And I use the Josh Shapiro example where, 5 or 6 days before his house got burned down on Passover, he gave $5 million to the local Muslim mosque. And 5 days later, a pro-Hamas protester burned down his house and specifically stated he wanted to burn them while they were inside. So, yeah, that's the self-hating Jew that gets under.
And especially the ones that aren't in the area or in the region that don't understand the conflict and think that they're safe, Like, I saw an interesting, I don't know if it was in a book I'm reading right now, where one of the October 7th, one of the people in Kibbutz Be'eri, because the Kibbutz Be'eri, as you know, most of those were very pro-Palestine, like pro-peace, would bring Palestinian, from Gaza, they'd bring Gazans over to work. They were the most liberal of the Israelis.
Yes, most of the people that were killed at the Nova Music Festival
were also.
They were what we would consider very left-wing liberals in this country, people that we battle, with every single day over ideology. They were on that side. And, you listen to some of them now and they're like, I can't believe I was so deceived, you know.
What this guy said specifically, so he was one of the families where he was a father and he's protecting his daughter, his son, his wife, and all of a sudden they're flooded with, 500 terrorists are there and they're just going door to door, knocking on the thing. They go into the safety room and they're trying to hold the door shut. And he's yelling to them, please leave, it's just women and children in here, me and women and children. And they're shooting bullets through the door.
Right.
So he lost his son got murdered in front of him, his wife got murdered in front of him. By chance, him and the daughter got away. He was being interviewed by the author of the book, and he said, what was your position now, and has it changed? And he goes, listen, I was very I was pro-Gazan, I was trying to help them, but there's a contract of enemies. In the worst of enemies, in the worst of wars, in the most modern time, there's a rule. You don't rape women. You don't murder babies purposefully, just shooting them in the head with a bullet. There's collateral damage and babies die, and that's tragic and terrible.
And all the fault of Hamas.
But there's very big difference in that than, the end product are still dead babies. I understand that. But it's very different than walking up to a baby and executing them, right? You don't do that.
Right.
And what he saw was a violation of these basic moral contracts that he can never unsee. So when you're dealing with that level of hate, and when you're talking about these Jews that are just trashing their own people, and it's almost like you're not recognizing what we're really dealing with. You think that this is some fanatical thing that we're saying here, that we're just extremists, but it's not. This is a level of hate that you have to face and you have to deal with. And if you're not, you're in danger to yourself and you're in danger to others. And it brings me to the Joe Rogan podcast. Did you watch where Doug Murray was on there? And for a lot of the viewers know, Doug Murray's a best-selling author, war journalist, been to many journals, an expert, I would say, in this subject, right? Yep. Expert in the cultures, expert in all this. And he was brought on there by Joe Rogan, and he was put on there with a comedian who is, I'd never heard of this guy before the Israel-Palestinian thing, and he's now making a living going on tour on every podcast. They're bringing him on as he's some kind of an expert. And as someone that knows the conflict and knows the region and it takes about 2 seconds. And it not just to notice that you disagree with him. That's fine. That's fair game.
Right.
But the guy has no idea what he's talking about.
Right.
He's literally working off Wikipedia. Right?
That's right.
And Joe Rogan literally was bringing him on as some kind of expert to debate Doug Murray, of all people, who's been entrenched in the region, who's written books about it.
Who's not Jewish, by the way.
Who's not Jewish.
Very important to point that out.
He's not Jewish. He's British. He's a gay guy. He's a British gay man. Probably one of the best debaters I've seen, period. Very eloquent speaking. Like, it's a pleasure to listen to the guy talk. And he literally just starts, he wanted to respond to what this guy was saying. And he said to him, he goes, well, let's talk about one of the crossings. He's like, well, I've never been. He goes, what about the other crossing? I've never been there either.
Right.
He's, you ever been in the region? He's like, no. And it just blew his mind. Like, how could you not be the region and hold yourself out as expert? And the problem is we have that so much now. The podcasters have become the experts, right? The big, huge viewings like Joe Rogan. It's scary, especially in this conflict, right?
Yeah, because there's so much misinformation, and then there's so much purposeful misinformation.
Right.
Sometimes I have these conversations with hostile, I call them enemies, and I'll speak factual data to them, and their response is, you're a baby killer. So, it's like, you've lost the argument when you resort to that. If you can't come back at me with facts and data, you've lost. And I felt like that's what that comedian did, and it was interesting to see Doug Murray's reaction, because he's there and, he's doing Joe Rogan's podcast, and there's still, even though you're having a conversation like we are, there's still some showmanship, right? There's still some, what's the word I'm looking, like show business involved. And still he had to stop Doug Murray and be like, wait a second.
What?
You never been there?
Right.
It's like, you haven't even gone to Israel? How can you call yourself an expert and you haven't even experienced it for yourself? And his answer was like, well, I have to have personal experience to be an expert.
Well, he said at first, he's like, to talk about it. And he was like, no, you can talk about whatever you want, but to hold yourself out as an expert. And then they played this two hats. They go, well, I never call myself an expert. I'm a comedian. Like, okay, you let other people call you an expert until you get called out, and then you hide behind the comedian cloak, right? Like, I'm not going to call myself an expert.
I don't call myself an expert.
Right.
I'm just well-read.
This is,
but
well-read on both sides, right?
Yes, of course.
So, and I think, like I said, we're uniquely positioned as litigators, that a good litigator is going to look for both sides.
Yes.
Because you mistrust everything you hear, right? We have to do.
It's after, for example, I have my materials here in front of me just for quick reference, and after I read my materials, my first question to myself is, okay, what are the other ones? What are the other guys saying?
What are they saying about
what's their perspective?
Right.
Because otherwise, I have no credibility if I'm going to make an argument if I only know of one side.
Right. It's like I had yesterday I did a bench trial yesterday. It was one of these restraining orders, right? I call them bench trials, but they're restraining orders, right?
Wow.
It is. But, a lot of times you walk in, you don't get to hear what the other side's going to say. You see it writing, but if they bring witnesses, you don't have depositions on them. You don't know what that person's going to say.
Right.
So I say to my client, listen, I have no idea how to prepare for that cross-exam because I'm just hearing your version of the events. And I have our argument sound, right? Yeah. But until I hear that other side, we're conditioned to look for that.
I do it all the time. I ask my clients.
We get to take the deposition, right? Let me hear what they're going to say here.
And I do that. I sit with my clients. I'm alone in the room with them, and I say, hey, listen, I need to hear all the...
Right.
I say, pretend you're her.
Right.
Tell me all of the things about you she's going to say.
Right.
And then it sort of disarms our clients, right? And, they feel like, okay, she's going to say that I hit her a couple times.
Right,
or
right,
I
right.
threw her off the bed. I'm like, oh, she's going to say that. Okay. So at least, now I have a better understanding. But I'm asking the questions. Yeah. I'm not just coming from, the perspective, oh, he told me he didn't do it, so therefore.
I told him yesterday, the example I used, listen, imagine I'm going into a fight with a boxer that has a mean right uppercut, and you're training me to go in there. Yeah. You're not going to tell me about his right uppercut? You're going to let me experience that myself before I learn? Or are you going to say, by the way, you're going to get thrown an uppercut right here?
So that I know how to deal with it.
So, we're uniquely... But this guy and these people there's an agenda, and the agenda might be likes, it might be publicity, and I say this stuff, because if you say pro-Palestine stuff, you're going to get a lot more views.
Right.
We got trashed on our podcast.
I love it.
You read some of the comments?
Oh, for sure.
Some of the comments, they just give it away. You know what's great? I left them too.
Yep.
And it's not, oh, the Zionists. No. It's one guy literally comment, well, I said something about, remember what I said? Like, I don't know how Hitler duped the Germans. Comment was, Hitler didn't dupe the Germans.
Yeah.
He called the Jews out for what they are. That's your comment. Just put that out there. That way everybody can see what this is about.
Right, of course. It always devolves into that because when you confront them with the facts, they have nowhere to go.
Right.
And that's the bottom line. So, you know, the answer to your question about what it's scary and what do we do with these podcasts, what do we do with all of this misinformation, is we have to educate. And we have to have podcasts like this where people tune in and call us all kinds of names, but they're still tuning in.
Right.
You know, they're still making the comments. They're still, you know, I had one today where I was talking to some gentleman and, you know, I simply posted something you sent me, the video of Bridget Gabriel, the Lebanese Christian woman.
Oh, yeah, that was
who knows way more about any of this than I think all of us put together.
Right.
And she went through the litany with beginning with the basic understanding of radical Islam.
Right.
Okay, and you know, I didn't make any comments. I just posted on this gentleman's page, and he and I were kind of going back and forth, and I posted that. And of course, instead of simply arguing why Bridget Gabriel was wrong, it went right to, well, you're a criminal. You know, you kill babies for sport. I'm like, okay. I mean, the argument, the conversation's over because you haven't, you know, refuted a single fact that she's alleged in her video. You just came at me, and I'm just the messenger. I just delivered the video. I didn't even say anything. So, I mean, key is always education.
Right. Right. And, you know, and some people would say, well, why don't you bring people on to bring people on to have the other side? I have no problem. When I find one that I think is really legitimately going to give me a good legitimate argument, I will. Yeah. Believe me, you're welcome to come on.
Yes, I would love for somebody to come on and you know, I would
debate
love
us
for,
on the facts.
Yes.
Don't debate us on rumors, on misinformation, and don't come in here talking that Jewish shit because I'll throw you off this podcast quicker.
Let's talk facts. Let's,
right?
you know.
Well, actually, come on here so we can show the viewers, you know, what a lot of this has to do with, you know. But I mean, if that was the case, then we would do that, you know. But I think it's very interesting. I think we got a lot of topics that I think we're going to dive in more. I think we go more specific into some of I'm looking just now, looking at some of our notes at the different times the Jews returned to their homeland.
Why do you suppose? I think it's important to cover that. You know, if you want to go into that now,
sure.
I'm happy.
I mean, I'm looking at just timelines that the Jews were returning. Like, people have this misconception that the Jews, and now understand, the Jews are from Judea and Samaria. You understand, the Eretz Israel, and they were scattered in diaspora, right? Europe, Ethiopia,
North
you name
Africa.
it, all over, right? All over.
Eastern Europe,
Right.
Russia.
So when it became an area that was able to come back, it starts in, the first one I'm looking at is 1882, okay? 1882, the first Aliyah. Wave brought 35,000 Jewish immigrants, primarily from Eastern Europe and Yemen. So much for Eastern Europe colonizers. These immigrants were motivated by the rising anti-Semitism in Europe and desire to establish the Jewish homeland. Second Aliyah, 1904 through 1914.
Right. So we go from 1882, right? Not that long ago, 227 years ago, or I'm sorry, 127 years ago, we started emigrating back to Palestine from Eastern Europe and Yemen, where we had a huge presence in Yemen.
Right.
Right. Jews were all involved high in the government in Yemen during that time.
And news for viewers, the Jews from Yemen aren't white. I know a bunch of them. They're my friends.
Yep.
They're darker than the day's long, so the white colonizer myth.
And from Morocco, North Africa, Tunisia.
I'm half Moroccan. My mother's side does not look white.
No.
So go ahead.
But you're right. So, you know, again, I bring this back to the opening comment where it's like only Jews can't immigrate. Everybody else, immigration is wide open and welcome. But when it comes to the Jews, if they were to immigrate, oh my God, you know, the penalty is death or expulsion.
Right.
So you're right. So it starts in mass back in 1982. You have, or 1882, 35,000 Jews from Eastern Europe and Yemen.
Right.
Okay.
But the myth is 1947, the Jews just showed up, all of them, on a boat.
Kicked everybody out of their
all the
houses,
out.
and that was it. But that's not what happened. So you have what we call Aliyah. What is Aliyah? Aliyah is a Hebrew, it's a...
Aliyah means
to immigrate.
Yeah.
It's just simple. It means to immigrate. And we have what we call Aliyahs. And we have, how many Aliyahs do we have? 6, 7, 8 Aliyahs. And in our notes here together, we have, like you said, the second Aliyah from 1904 to 1914. So for a 10-year period, 40,000 Jews made Aliyah from Russia, Poland, and literally developed that land, right? Most
It
of it
was
was swampland.
Swampland, that's another thing.
Government-owned land, non-productive land, not land that was inhabited by any significant population.
Right.
And they were farmers. They went there, and agriculture was the industry. And then the third Aliyah, 1919 to 1923, after World War I. Obviously, when everything was being restructured and reconfigured, you had the Jews that came from Eastern Europe. Same thing, farmers. And then as we got closer to the rise of Adolf Hitler, right, in the late 30s, then you had 80,000 is the number that came mostly from Poland, and they were running from anti-Semitism because the pogroms were in Russia, the pogroms were in Europe, in obviously Poland, Germany, and then right around, let's see, 1929 to 1939, the fifth Aliyah, 250,000, big number from Germany and Eastern Europe, fleeing Nazism.
Right.
Now, also important to understand, again, there's this perception that when they arrived there, you had a thriving metropolis
Barren
full
land.
of Arabs, and that the Jews came in and just kicked them out, and that is not what happened.
Right.
You had this sort of barren land that was occupied by Jews and Arabs, and then when the Jews came and started to build up those communities, after right around World War II. So I mean, this is the way it happened. It was an immigration in order to escape genocide.
Right. And that's what it's either getting kicked out or returned to escape. There's never been a safe land for Jews. The United States, right? The United States relative, to all these other places. And now look at the United States is scary. It's scary.
You have, listen, I've heard from many Jews and Israelis that feel safer in Israel now than they do here in the United States.
Oh, for sure. That's a common theme I'm hearing right now.
And this is part of the irony, is that Israel is necessitated by all of what we just discussed.
Right.
Because without a state, we are subject to the whims of whatever state is offering us refuge at the time. And you know how that changes with the wind. So because of that is the necessity for Israel. So they say, okay, in Europe and in Russia at the time, right, it's get out of here and go back to Palestine, where you came from. So then the Jews get out of there and they go back to Palestine where they came from, and then they're in Palestine where they came from, and it's get out of Palestine, go back to Poland, where you came from.
Right.
So, these are the arguments that we find ourselves faced with on a daily basis.
Right. Well, I think we end it there right now before we don't want to lose too many viewers
No.
because it's too much information and we don't want everybody to see it in segments. We'll have you back soon, of course, and we'll go into more specific topics. But
Do we have, I'm sorry to interrupt, do we have the capacity for exhibits?
Sure.
Okay, because I think maps are huge, and
Sure.
I think that it for me anyway, and I've been studying this for 20 years. It's impossible to really understand without the maps, because when you see it on the map, you're like, oh wow, I understand now.
Right.
I understand the geography, and I understand the relationship between where these people live and where these people live, and why we have the conflicts that we have, and I think that's huge. So I think maybe that's something we can.
Well, we'll do it next time.
Yep.
Again, thanks for coming on, Lloyd. Always
welcome.
a pleasure to have you, my brother.
Glad to be here.
And we'll see you soon. I'll have you back on. And thank you all the listeners and viewers. Thanks for watching Two Taps and Friends. Please like and subscribe to the channel. I'm being told that I have to ask you that every time. We're on YouTube, YouTube Music, iHeart Music. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're everywhere. Like and subscribe. Love you all. Thank you for listening. Goodbye. Cut.